Hi, my name is Naseem Mithoowani. I practice immigration and refugee law, and I've been doing that exclusively for over a decade. I currently work at a law firm called Mithoowani Waldman Immigration Law Group. You can find me online at www.mwlawgroup.ca. And I've been asked to speak to you about something that I know is top of mind for a lot of us, and that's the situation in Afghanistan, and specifically what we're doing for refugees from Afghanistan here in Canada. So a couple of quick points before we start. This is an ever-evolving situation, and if you've been following anything in the news, you'll know that day to day there's changes on the ground in Afghanistan, and as a result, there are changes that are being made to immigration programs here in Canada. Furthermore, because this is a situation that's come up very suddenly, there is a lot of information that IRCC has hinted to or has said is forthcoming, but we don't have the details exactly yet. So there's a lot about these programs that's still unknown. And then to add on to that uncertainty, of course, we are in an election period right now. And so what is true today may not be true in a few months if government changes configurations, and these things we know have a huge impact on things like refugee programs and immigration programs generally. So a good way to keep on top of things, because like I said, what we speak about today may not be relevant when you're watching this in a week or a month from now. A few good tips are to follow IRCC on Twitter. They often release information there first, and you can interact with IRCC, which is Immigration and Refugee Citizenship Canada, our governmental department. You can interact with them on Twitter pretty easily. You can also keep referring back to immigration's website and make sure there are a lot of websites out there. If you think you're on Canadian Immigration Department's website, it'll have a domain that has canada.ca. And once you see that domain, you know that this is a reputable Canadian source. You also should know that there are a number of lawyer groups that are taking on the cause of Afghan refugees on a pro bono basis and are currently in the midst of organizing themselves so they can offer these services to the public. A few to watch are the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, or CARL, and the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program. I expect that there will be many organizations that offer pro bono services to people looking to help Afghans or Afghans themselves that are looking for assistance. A few things to watch out for are changing information like we've talked about. So when there is information that you think is relevant to your situation, what I would recommend people do is screenshot that so that you can later refer to it and show others to make sure that it is in fact valid information. I expect that there will be a lot of misinformation and a lot of speculation, so you're going to want to be very careful to weed out what's true and from a government source that you can rely on and what may be from somewhere else. Another quick thing that I am going to mention now is that what I'm going to share with you today are the programs that are available now. This is not meant to be legal advice. If you do have a question about your particular situation, I would recommend that you speak to a lawyer. You can also speak to your local member of parliament at the federal level. They should be able to assist you. And there are a few emails and phone numbers that the government has set out dedicated to help individuals understand these programs. So I'm going to give these to you now. They're also available on IRCC or Immigration Department's website. So just make sure that you're on the right canada.ca website. Some email addresses that are helpful are irc.situationafghanistan.ircc@cic.gc.ca. That's an immigration website or email address where you can ask questions about your particular situation. There's also, for individuals that have assisted Canadian troops in Afghanistan, there is a email address that you can use, and that's Canada/Afghanistan@international.gc.ca. A phone number that you can reach a government agent to speak about the situation in Afghanistan and immigration particularly is 613-321-4243. And I understand that this number has extended hours from I think it's 7 in the morning till about 7 at night. So those are a few places or resources that you can check, particularly, like I said, because what I'm going to share with you may change over time. Now, if you have been following the news at all, you may have heard about the number 20,000 as the number of refugees that we wish to take in Canada. That's the government's goal. And I think it's important to think about this number in context, because certainly 20,000 does seem like a lot. But once you start putting that number in perspective, you'll see that really we're not doing terribly well on the resettlement of refugees. There are already this year estimates that over 500,000 Afghans have been displaced just so far this year. And that's adding on to the existing 2.8 million Afghan refugees that are either have been recognized as refugees or are seeking refugee status. There are estimates that if we continue the way that things are continuing, we may see upwards of 500,000 more Afghans that have fled their country by the end of the year. Right now, the top producing refugee countries are Syria, Venezuela, and Afghanistan. Now, of all of these millions of individuals that have had to flee for their lives, Canada really doesn't see many. In fact, the West in general sees very few of these refugees. Pakistan and Iran currently host the most Afghan refugees. We also see a number of refugees traverse the seas into Europe through places like Greece and Turkey. But Canada and the US are largely spared because geographically we're quite far, we're difficult to reach. We also have programs in place to discourage refugees from reaching our shores at all. For example, if you do land first in the US and try and make your way up to Canada to make a refugee claim, at that Canadian-US border, we won't hear your refugee claim. You're not eligible if you've come from because you've come from the US, and that's a particular agreement that we have with the US called the Safe Third Country Agreement. So really, Canada isn't taking on a huge burden in terms of refugees, given our resources, given our population and its need for refugees and immigrants to sustain our population. This really isn't a terribly huge number of individuals. In terms of how the government has indicated that 20,000 will split up, there are two main ways. So the first is that if you are an Afghan national who has assisted the Canadian government, and so what we're thinking here are of interpreters that helped the armed forces people who worked in Canadian offices in Afghanistan. And if you were also in Afghanistan as of July 22nd, 2021. Now, you could have left after that, but that's the date that you had to have been physically in Afghanistan. Then you can apply for refuge or immigration status in Canada. If you think you meet this particular program, the process is that you would email Canada/Afghanistan@international.gc.ca. You indicate why you think you fit this criteria, include any documentation that you have of your work with Canadian government or armed forces. And eventually, if you do qualify, you'll be sent forms and sent instructions on how to formally make the application. The second way really isn't a new way at all. It's an existing program that we have, and that's for refugees overseas to be sponsored to Canada. It's unclear to me if the government is going to increase capacity or funding for this program for Afghan refugees, is going to relax certain requirements to make it easier for Afghan refugees to qualify under this program. Right now, we don't have a lot of information aside from the fact that there are already existing options, including government-assisted refugees and more privately sponsored refugees. Government-assisted refugees will be referred to the government by agencies like the UNHCR. So you can't apply directly. These people will have been pre-selected, and the Government of Canada, along with UNHCR, will work together to bring these individuals to Canada. They are outside of their country of origin, so they're outside of Afghanistan and in places where they don't have a viable option to live long-term, either because the countries that they've fled to don't recognize refugees, or if they do, they don't grant them full rights, and they don't have a pathway to citizenship. If you're not part of that group, you could also come through private Canadian groups. And there are two main ways to do that. The first is that your application goes through what's known as a sponsorship agreement holder, or an SAH. So these are community organizations, church, religious institutions, mosques that have already been vetted by the government to take on refugees. And once they have a certain quota per year of refugees that they can help. Once the organization has found a refugee that they want to help, then the process is that the application is made and it's dealt with through the overseas visa office. There aren't many sponsorship agreement holders, and the ones that we do have are quite inundated with requests from people that want them to consider their situation or their relative for private sponsorship. So that's a difficult option. And the other option that we've heard a lot about, and some of you may have had experience with Syrian refugees in 2015, are groups of 5. So these are 5 Canadian citizens or permanent residents that come together and pledge financial support for a certain period of time for individual refugees that they know of, or that have been selected by the government as particularly vulnerable. The difficulty is that typically, if you're going through the group of 5 process, the individual refugee outside of their country of origin has to have either UNHCR refugee designation or refugee designation from the country that they're living in. However, there are many countries in which the UNHCR doesn't have a presence, and there's many countries where there's no formal refugee recognition. So that makes that's a stumbling block to this program. And we don't know yet if the government is considering removing that particular requirement. They did, for example, in 2015 with Syrian refugees. That would certainly allow a lot more people to apply. Now, like I said before, the people that are eligible for these programs are no different than in normal times or for other countries. They're people that are outside of their country of origin, in this case, Afghanistan, and they don't have a durable option in terms of integrating long term to the country where they fled. The government has signaled that there is a second type of person that will apply or can qualify under this program. And that's family members of individuals who are already in Canada and who have helped the Canadian government in Afghanistan. So someone, for example, who worked as an interpreter is now in Canada and has a child or a spouse overseas. In that way, currently, we're told that they may qualify under this program. However, we don't have any more information on that program, and we're waiting for the government to release that information. So outside of those quote unquote special programs, there are also other measures that the government has taken to help Afghans, particularly Afghans with connections to Canada, either through family members or because they're already here. So if you are sponsoring someone from Afghanistan as a spouse or as a dependent or adopted child, that application can be expedited, and certain fees that you would usually pay to immigration can be waived. Similarly, if you are already a recognized refugee in Canada from Afghanistan, and you are now applying to become a permanent resident, then your application may be expedited, and that can include the inclusion of family members that qualify who are overseas. If you are an Afghan national in Canada on either a student permit, a work permit, or as a visitor, and you wish to extend your stay, that application will be given priority processing. Now, if you are an Afghan national who's not in Canada, but wishes to come to Canada as a student, a visitor, or a worker, your application will also be expedited if you have an eligible Canadian permanent resident or citizen who lives in Canada also. We also have heard from the Refugee Board that existing refugee claims from individuals from Afghanistan will be expedited, and they can also be accepted without the need for a full hearing and the full process on the basis of a paper application. So these are some ways in which the government is trying to help out individuals who are already here, who have links to Canada. Now, if you think that the government isn't doing enough for Afghan refugees, one suggestion that I would make is that you voice that concern to your member of parliament. We saw in 2015 a real appetite of Canadians to help Syrians, and that really spurred the government into action and into creating new and simplified procedures. There's no reason why that can't happen again if the appetite is there. In this case, I think that morally we have an even greater obligation to the individuals of Afghanistan, because of course in some ways our very actions there, asking Afghans to work with us and work with our allies, for example, has created situations of risk for them directly. And so I would say that although there are some promising signals from government, and 20,000 is better than none when you think about the millions of individuals that are requiring assistance, and the fact that we share some responsibility for their current risk and current need. I do question whether it's enough, and we'll see if Canada does even more, and it will only do more if we, as a country, demand that. So again, if anything that you've heard today is unclear and you want more information, follow IRCC on Twitter. Check out canada.ca websites for more information. Speak to your member of parliament. Reach out to an immigration and refugee lawyer. Reach out to an organization of refugee lawyers that does this work, such as, for example, the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program, and there'll be many others, I'm sure. And finally, the email addresses and numbers that I gave at the beginning of this session can also be of help. If you wish to reach me, you can find my contact information at www.mwlawgroup.ca. And it's a pleasure to share what information I have with you. And let's hope that it becomes more plentiful, clearer, and hopefully that we see a little more movement on this file in the future. Thanks so much.